Why don't I start with this question? I think maybe I will direct this towards, Sarah, I'll start with you, and if others want to chime in. So, older adults are not digital natives. Doesn't that make it more of a challenge to develop technology for geriatric health versus younger people, where the barriers are lower?
Absolutely, it does, but you'd be surprised at how adaptive people are. We have found that it's less and less of a barrier all the time. Making universal design available and principles in either a smartphone or on the web is critical to making things usable. But I think, as Dilip showed, people are very willing to adopt technology and are interested in what the newfangled thing is. So it's less of a challenge, I think, than you would think.
Do you guys?
I'll add that making a case for using the technology is critical. I think older adults are less likely to have exploratory use of technology, but if it's critical and you can make a use case for it, adoption rates are fairly comparable to younger adults.
Great.
In my experience, the critical component for us developing these smartphone apps was to focus group it with these participants. We learned a tremendous amount. There's just a few characteristic things that older folks don't like. They don't like surprises on the devices while they're using them. That's a big no-no. So we had to pretty much start over from scratch. We thought we were very clever and had this figured out, but actually sitting down and testing it out with old people was a huge critical step for us.
I think that testing out part is actually a really good point. Some of the games that people assume are engaging for younger people may not be so engaging. A researcher out of Florida was evaluating whether older people like the games of violence, the shoot-'em-up games. They hate that. Finding more socially nurturing kinds of engaging games are much more likely to be successful.
Great. Thank you, guys. Thanks for the question. So this is a question. Dilip, I'll ask you this question if you can hear me okay. Seniors are often concerned with privacy and security, and how do you get this group to adopt digital health when they're so wary of these concerns? Why don't one of you guys answer that question?
Yeah, it's very interesting because ARP's very aware that older people are subject to scams, and we're trying to balance, making people aware of some of the privacy concerns when dealing with technology. But it's about creating trusted information, making sure that people are understanding who is reaching out to them and building that level of trust over time, and making sure that what you do with their personal information, you're letting them know, they're seeing it, and you're treating it with respect and confidentiality.
And I would add transparency and control to that. We found in our work that you can convince people of the value of continuous monitoring, for example, if you give them the ability to turn it off. So I think if people have control over when they're monitored and when they're not, they're much more apt to go with it. And I think transparency is the second thing. I think knowing what's being used, where the data are being stored, who is keeping the data is crucial. Lisa Rosenfeld and John Torres are in the audience. We did a little project looking at privacy apps for dementia, and we think there's a serious issue there with lack of clarity of what's actually happening with this information. So I think transparency and then giving the people being monitored the control over what's being monitored and how, I think, is crucial.
Great. So Jason, this is a question for you, but I'm going to add a second part, maybe a part B to it as well. So one is, do you have any independent validation that day-to-day fluctuations that you were mentioning are clinically meaningful? And the part B to that question is, do you think that some of the really disappointing negative clinical trials, if you will, in mild to moderate AD with some of the amyloid-targeted therapies are actually related to some of these issues with measurement?
Yeah, so the answer to the first question is that's one of the aims of our grant that we're looking at, is to determine whether disease effects are underlying the variability that we see. But right now, we don't have a lot of evidence to support that. There are other things that we're considering too, like time of day effects. And the answer to the other one is yes, I think a lot of the trials have missed precisely because they were underpowered. In order to get a drug approved in Alzheimer's disease, you have to show a cognitive benefit depending on what the indication of the disease. If it's for secondary prevention, you have to show a cognitive benefit. And there have been a number of trials that have just missed because of unexpected variants that occurred in the placebo group, for example. So they probably are working, but they just didn't detect it because they were underpowered.
I'll just reinforce that last point about how these trials just missed. We've been involved in a number of these really lengthy secondary prevention trials and also some of the trials of patients with disease. And the clinical benefit, of course, you don't know what patients are on, but we've had people on open label treatment for up to 5 or 6 years with relatively remarkable stability of symptoms and a significant change after drug was withdrawn because the trial failed. So I think we need to do, I mean, the work you're doing, Jason, is going to really have a huge impact in terms of our ability to interpret these trials. I'm going to ask one more question, then see if anyone else from the audience has it if we have time. So, Sarah, for you, Dilip had mentioned that aging starts at conception, and should the council that you're working on use SHARP to study health behaviors across the lifespan? Has that been considered as all, whether it's with regards to psychosis and other mental health issues that are lifespan-wide?
That has absolutely been a factor. Questions of when can you impact and when can you make a difference in a person's life are some of the questions that we are grappling with. If you wait until you're 75 to start exercising, for example, what are going to be the effects? And so far the council has been talking in terms of it's never too late, but trying to reinforce the idea that the sooner you start, the better your results. So the complexities of evaluating people over time are huge, but when you you're trying to influence behavior at later stages, you can't erase the 70 years that have come before. But I think that we have to keep that as a primary factor, but this idea that you can actually change your behavior at any time, and disabusing people of the idea that you are calcified once you reach a certain age is incredibly important. So yes, it's important what happens your entire lifespan, but the ability to change and adapt is still there.
Great. So maybe one more minute. If anyone has any other questions and would love to come up to the microphone, we will take maybe another question. Anyone?
I just have a comment. That was phenomenally informative, and I appreciate all the information shared and the resources shared as well.
Thank you, Carol. Dr. Ressler.
On active versus passive apps.
Yep. So I'm going to repeat the question just in case Dilip may hear it. The difference between active versus passive apps. Who wants to tackle that one? Ipsit or Jason?
I think the definition is an active app involves the user entering information or sort of consciously engaging with the app in some way, whereas passive apps are the ones that measure or track behavior. So GPS keeping track of where a person is moving, even though they may never actually take their smartphone out. I think it's two very different qualities of data that you get. Ideally, you want both. Some of what Jason was talking about, for example, is sort of classic active app use. And yesterday we heard presentations from JP Onella and others that talk about the value of passive data. I think in aging, I have some questions about the value of apps and mobile devices in general, only because the way older adults interact or live with these devices is fundamentally different. I think powerful as mobile devices are for this population and other clinical populations, there is still the issue of what happens when the device is sitting on a table or in a drawer or charging, which is not to say these are not extraordinarily powerful tools, but I think to really capture naturalistic behavior, you need mobile and environmental.
Well, and I think the power of wearable devices and our tremendous to help with that. And people of all ages. Are you guys familiar with the Cavilli trial in New York City, where they're following kids, all the families, entire ages, and they've actually inserted wearable devices in clothing so that even young kids can wear it, and older people, if they were not able to strap on a wristwatch, they are able to be monitored in very helpful ways. So I think we're going to get just great information from that.
I think matching the technology with the clinical question at hand is really what it comes down to, that there still isn't the one thing that can do it all, but we have a tool that can get at a large diversity of clinical problems, and I think that's the right way to use it.
I want to thank all 4 of our speakers today. Thanks to you in the audience, and look forward to the rest of the symposium.